Hi, I'm Hal Roberts, filling in for Theresa Skubic. This is Forum Daily for Monday, August the 11th. Air Canada flight attendants held brief pickets at airports in 4 major Canadian cities today, and what their union is calling a National Day of Action. Demonstrations took place by flight attendants at international airports in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and Vancouver. The Canadian Union of Public Employees says it's looking to raise awareness about what it calls poverty wages and unpaid labor when working on a plane when it's not in the air. The two sides have been in contract talks since January. Members have voted in strong favor of a strike mandate and could walk off the job as early as Saturday. Air Canada said last week that it believes there's still time to get a deal done. According to senior military officials, the federal government's pay increase for the Canadian Armed Forces will provide some much-needed support. It will help the lowest-ranking positions who are struggling in the face of rising costs. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $2 billion per year graduated series of salary top-ups and incentives.
By announcing that all members of the Canadian Armed Forces will receive a pay raise. Specifically, there will be an 8% raise for colonels and above, a 13% raise for lieutenant colonels and below, and a 20% raise in starting pay for privates in the regular force. These increases will be retroactive to April 1st of this year. There'll be increases on top of base pay, putting more money in the pockets of everyone. We will also introduce a new military service pay benefit specifically tied to time in service, so that paychecks honor years in uniform. We will also introduce additional supports in the coming months for members preparing for combat and high-risk training, so they are paid fairly in addition for those intense commitments. We will make posting allowances fairer, based on how many times members have had to uproot their lives, the lives of their families, to protect ours. And will give more support when those moves take them far from their families.
South of the border, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced he is taking control of the Washington, D.C. police. He says he will also be deploying the National Guard to D.C. to help with crime-fighting efforts in the region.
So today we're declaring public safety emergency in the District of Columbia, and Attorney General Pam Bondi, who's fantastic, is taking command of the Metropolitan Police Department as of this moment. And I'll be making the appropriate notifications to Congress and to the mayor, our new DEA administrator, who's one of the top in the country. This city will no longer be a sanctuary for illegal alien criminals. We will have full, seamless, integrated cooperation at all levels of law enforcement, and we'll deploy officers across the district with an overwhelming presence. You'll have more police, and you'll be so happy.
European nations have rallied behind Ukraine, emphasizing that peace cannot be achieved without Kyiv's involvement. This comes before a planned meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. For more on this, I chatted with our correspondent Wyatt Sharp earlier today. Now, Wyatt, European leaders say peace cannot be achieved without Ukraine's involvement. How do you really interpret that stance in the context of these upcoming talks?
Yeah, it's interesting. What you're really hearing from a lot of European leaders, a lot of European officials, is that a deal with Ukraine cannot be reached without Ukraine at the table. Of course, it's one of the major parties involved in this conflict. They are a sovereign and independent country who, of course, the invasion has really been ongoing ever since 2014, of course, with the invasion of Crimea, which is something that I think oftentimes gets forgotten within the mainstream news and the mainstream press, because all you hear about is, that the conflict started in 2022 with respect to the escalation of the war. And, it's unfortunate because obviously what this means is the fact that the conflict has been ongoing for so long that it seems to have been forgotten about. And it seems as if, what Donald Trump is, thinking to himself right now is a sentiment that a lot of people have been thinking. And that is that we need to do whatever we need to do to get Russia to stop without actually thinking, what can we do to ensure that Ukraine's sovereignty can be protected?
Now, what specific risks do you see if Kyiv is pressured into giving up territory as part of a peace deal?
Well, I think the main thing that's kind of obvious has to do with the precedent that it will set. I mean, there's a number of different wars and geopolitical conflicts happening, especially overseas right now. And, if Ukraine, for example, is pressured into giving up really any amount of territory, then all of a sudden, likely you'll start to see Israel, for example, having to force different things, or you'll, start to see other conflicts in the Middle East as well, perhaps, where, different countries and different parties involved in some of these conflicts are going to have to give up different things and make certain concessions, which of course is something that sovereign, independent countries, again, countries like Ukraine, countries like Israel, people who are fighting conflicts against some of these foreign, really aggressive powers, they just simply shouldn't have to do that.
So, Wyatt, how might the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska really shape the broader international response to the war?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, of course, we're starting to see some reaction again because European leaders are the ones who have been making those statements that Ukraine must be involved at the table. So you're seeing them kind of a little bit angry with Donald Trump and the American administration more broadly. Of course, that's not new, right? That's not specific to this issue. If you look even to Canada's Prime Minister, of course, Mark Carney, the relationship has been pretty tense there. This might only kind of further make that relationship more tense because, of course, people will remember that when Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, came into the Oval Office for a meeting with President Trump a few months back, Donald Trump, was a little bit kind of hostile towards Volodymyr Zelensky throughout that meeting. And so people might look at this depending on how the meeting with Vladimir Putin goes, right? I think if the meeting with Vladimir Putin is just as toxic or just as hostile as the one with Volodymyr Zelensky seemingly was, people might not be as frustrated. But if Donald Trump comes and he makes kind of the similar kind of friendly bromance style rhetoric that he did back when they met for the G7 in 2018, then I think, you're going to start to see some anger and frustration within kind of the headlines because people will wonder, well, why are you talking to someone who is a dictator, who is a war criminal in one way, but talking to another guy who is a sovereign and independent leader in, a more kind of hostile way?
Let's talk a little bit more about U.S. President Donald Trump. He's advanced his deadline for additional sanctions on Russia, Wyatt. Now, do you think this really strengthens or undermines his negotiating position?
I think it'll kind of all depend, right? Because after, the meeting goes, depending on how it goes, we know Donald Trump is very much into retaliation and kind of revenge, based politics, if you will. So if the meeting with Vladimir Putin goes poorly, I think what you'll start to see is Donald Trump maybe imposing those sanctions almost immediately after. And that's been some of the discussion that we've been seeing because Donald Trump, again, you look to tariffs, for example, another story that's been in the news a lot recently. When he doesn't like how things are going, he uses these different tools as really negotiating tactics to try and get other countries to bow down to his demands and to make concessions to him. So I think he might end up using some of these sanctions in a similar way, if necessary, to try and get Vladimir Putin back to the table. Because, aside from being willing to meet with Donald Trump, the two have actually had a pretty tense relationship, especially over the course of the past few months. Going back to his first term, actually, all things considered, wasn't that poor of a relationship, and they were known for getting along, in the same way that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump seemingly got along. But this time, Donald Trump has publicly come out a number of different times over the course of his administration, posting to Truth Social, etc., saying that he's frustrated with Vladimir Putin because he is continuing to bomb, he's continuing to go after the people of Ukraine without actually, willing to discuss why is he doing it or what is actually behind it all.
So let me ask you something. Where do we go from here if no agreement is reached and we get just and lasting peace?
Yeah, I mean it's obviously the $1 million question. I think a lot of people right now are just kind of wondering, how do we stop the fighting? And again, it's the same question if you look to other conflicts right now happening overseas. Of course, perhaps the other one that is most obvious is between Israel and Hamas. And it is, whether or not you agree with either side, the reality is that civilians and the people are the ones who are going to be impacted most at the end of the day. So again, it's the same question whether you look to Israeli citizens, whether you look to people in Gaza, whether you look to the people of Ukraine, or even, quite frankly, the people of Russia who are living under this regime of Vladimir Putin as well, right? Because you have to think to yourselves, how do we ensure that the civilians who might be getting fed propaganda, who might not be fully informed, are actually aware of what their governments are doing? And, all things considered, Volodymyr Zelensky is not, all that of a leader either. There's certainly been a number of things that have been said about him in the past as well. And certainly he's been involved in some shady dealings as well himself. And so I think just really ensuring that people have all the answers and all the facts are something that, if that can happen, I think what you'll start to see perhaps is more of a people-led revolt towards some of these figures, and that might actually be what can put a end to the war. Because right now you have two very egotistical leaders who are fighting back and forth. And actually, as Donald Trump said, again, with respect to the conflict in Israel, I think the same sentiment can be said with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. And that is that, countries have been fighting for so long and they just don't know what they're doing. Of course, Russia is the aggressor in this conflict and they should be treated as such. But, Ukraine certainly needs to come to the negotiating table, which hopefully the American administration and Donald Trump will allow on Friday in Alaska.
Correspondent Wyatt Sharp, thanks so much for this.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll be joined by Brendan Caldwell from Caldwell Securities Limited, who will help explain the meaning behind many common financial buzzwords. Stay with us. Investing can feel like learning a whole new language, especially when financial experts start throwing around terms like diversification, asset allocation, or risk tolerance, as if everyone knows exactly what they're talking about. But let's be honest, a lot of people nod along without fully understanding how these concepts actually apply to their very own money. They can be a bit of a problem. Now, whether you're just starting out to invest or managing a growing portfolio, understanding these core principles is what separates confident investors from those who are flying blind. Joining us to make sense of it all is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Hal, great to be here. Wonderful to talk to you.
You as well. So, Brendan, what does diversification actually mean, and how do you know if you're really diversified?
Well, let's start with your introductory comment. I think all professions use buzzwords, jargon, terminology to make themselves appear smarter than what they actually are. Now, if you're a doctor or a lawyer, an accountant, you may actually be quite smart. But the investment business could be all over the place. So we like to use buzz terms just to sort of make us feel that we have a leg up, have a certain superiority. So take a term like diversification. I mean, if you want to dial it back to the Aesop's fable, it's not having all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
And being diversified or otherwise may or may not be the right approach for you. Having one basket with all your eggs in it and watching that basket very closely is how people who became very, very rich tended to do it. They focused on one thing. But that's one thing that they usually had a hand in the outcome. To the extent that you're owning investments that are passive, where you're not actively managing the company or the property or the other whatever the asset is, to the extent that either other people are looking after it or that it sort of looks after itself, having diversification is having assets that don't always do the same thing at the same time. So that, and if they aren't vulnerable to the same stresses. Now, some people may be diversified by saying that, well, I'm I have all my money in I have money in real estate, and then I have money in the stock market, but the stock market investments, say, are in real estate investment trusts. And their living is as a real estate agent. I mean, that sort of thing would be the opposite of diversification. That would be heavy concentration. Now, if real estate does well, you may do extremely well not being diversified. But for most people, most of the time, that want to actually do what they do and have other people look after their money, having money in investments that don't work the same way at the same time, which would include real estate, the stock market, something in investments that are guaranteed, that aren't all going up, or more importantly, not all going down together. Being diversified means something like that. Having investments that perform in different ways at different times, so that overall your wealth doesn't take big dips, big ups and downs, but grows hopefully a little more smoothly.
You know, I wish I would have invested in real estate in Toronto and Vancouver 20, 30 years ago. That would have been something. So, Brendan, let me ask you something. What is asset allocation, and why does it matter more than picking stocks?
Well, let's take your analogy about real estate. I mean, Calgary has been a wonderful place to invest at certain times. I think that's where you're based, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
So But yeah, Vancouver and Toronto have done extraordinarily well for the last while and maybe continue to do so. But if you're looking about real estate, not all regions are going to do well at the same time. But real estate as a whole tends to work very much together. I mean, particularly on the downside, we saw that in the 2008 financial crisis. Canada did not get hit nearly as badly as the United States, but real estate all over the world took a bit of a hit, which is why having all one's money in real estate probably not the best way to do it. Having some money in real estate, which can be very good for the long term, but if you need money quickly, very hard to get at it. The stock market tends to do something different than real estate for various reasons. It tends to actually go up and go down, and then the real estate market tends to follow suit. So and then there's really another couple of asset classes which have emerged for investors in the recent times. One is private equity, that is money invested in businesses that aren't publicly listed on the stock market. Now, people are in private equity in as much as they own their own business, but having investments in businesses that maybe are in different industries, particularly in technology, there have been a number of great success stories, but having diversification, to use our earlier buzzword, in and around the private equity sphere, in the private equity asset class, means that you can participate in some of the good ideas that maybe one doesn't have an active part in the business in. So private equity, real estate, stocks, fixed income, that is bonds, GICs, they have been a worthwhile asset class for a long period of time, but it's very difficult to convince people that it's an exciting place to have one's money at 4 or 5%, and interest rates are even a little bit less than that now. So the last one is, I guess, crypto, which is a tough one to know what to do with because it's done so very well since the late 2000s to this point, gone from a few $100s a Bitcoin to what, $120,000 today. So, but that is another asset, and all of these different asset classes tend to work differently. So it's having different asset classes that work differently is a good way of getting diversification, to link our two buzzwords together.
So, Brendan, what does risk tolerance actually mean? And how does it differ from risk capacity?
Okay. Well, I would say risk tolerance differs from person to person. And this is why I think it's very important to have a good investment advisor. That's probably the most important investment decision, or someone that you can at least talk through and hear yourself out loud talk about what risk really means to you. Because in the investment business, just like there are buzzwords, there are mathematical models, again, to make us appear smarter than what we are. Call it mean variance or standard deviation or other more esoteric measures of risk. The Sortino ratio, whatever that is. So there are ways that we can measure risk, but that's not the same for a real person as what are the chances I'm going to lose my money and never get it back again? I mean, that might be people's bottom line risk tolerance. And even if that's not a likely outcome, if the fear of that happening causes them to pull money out at exactly the worst times, then they've probably exceeded their risk tolerance. I would say risk capacity is how much money can you invest, and if it doesn't work out, that it really affect your ability to exist day to day or in the future. So I don't think you want to make too many investments that affect your risk, that would negatively affect your ability to live. And some people get the bug. They borrow money to invest, which automatically, literally leverages up your risk, because time, which is normally the friend of the investor, is your friend if you're investing with your own money, but it becomes your enemy if you're investing with borrowed money, because every single day interest rates are working against you. The effect of compounding, and also the stress factor, because if the markets go down, you're losing your money first and only the lender's money later. So I think that a risk capacity, what are the chances, or what is the ability of this investment to really impact my lifestyle? And risk tolerance, I think, is more, what can I live with? And that's best discussed with someone who's had that conversation, is able to ask the right questions.
Now, we only have a couple of minutes left here, but I wanted to ask you, What does it really mean when someone says the market is efficient? And does that mean that stock picking is pointless?
I think that's probably what they mean. And I don't know that it was ever true, because to the extent that one knows more about a stock, be it a private company or a public company, than the world in general. And I don't mean insider information. I mean really knows, like a young person a few years back that knew about Roblox, or that knows today about AI, or is following a particular fashion, like Aritzia or Sephora. My kids have bought those. Sephora is owned by LVMH, the big French multinational. So if you know more about a company or a product than the rest of the world, then I think stock picking makes a great deal of sense, because you're investing what you know. Now, the idea of the efficient market hypothesis is that it doesn't matter what stocks you pick, because if you buy the market, you're getting the benefit of a million people making a million individual decisions, millions and millions of investors making millions of individual decisions. The funny thing is, right now, with more and more people going to index investing, passive investing, buying the market, it means you've got not millions of people making millions of individual decisions, but millions of people making but a single decision, that is to buy the index, to buy the market. So I think actually there's more opportunities now in individual stock picking than there may have ever been in a long time, because invariably when everybody's doing one thing, the opportunity is usually elsewhere.
Brendan Caldwell with Caldwell Securities Limited. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.
Coming up, we'll have more of today's national and international headlines. Stay with us. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described Israel's planned expansion of military operations as a dangerous escalation. He says he's really concerned for the safety of the 2 million civilians trapped in the enclave, along with the remaining Israeli hostages still being held captive. In an emergency meeting requested by the UK, France, Slovenia, Denmark, and Greece, ambassadors to the United Nations met in the Security Council at UN headquarters in New York City on Sunday.
We, the United Kingdom, Denmark, France, Greece, and Slovenia call for today's urgent meeting of the Security Council on the situation in Gaza. We condemn the government of Israel's decision to further expand its military operations in Gaza. This plan risks violating international humanitarian law. We call on Israel to urgently reverse this decision and not to implement it. And we reiterate that any attempts at annexation or of settlement extension violate international law. Expanding military operations will only endanger the lives of all civilians in Gaza, including the remaining hostages, and result in further unnecessary suffering. The Security Council has consistently called for the unconditional and immediate release of all the hostages. And we are clear that Hamas must disarm and play no future role, no future part in the governance of Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority must have a central role. But this decision by the Israeli government will do nothing to secure the return of the hostages and risk further endangering their lives. It will also worsen the already catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza and risks further death and mass displacement of Palestinian civilians.
The debate focusing on the situation in the Middle East and in the Gaza Strip elicited a passionate and controversial exchange. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he expected to complete a new Gaza offensive fairly quickly as the UN Security Council heard new demands for an end to suffering in the Palestinian enclave.
I'm glad you came here because I'd like to take the opportunity to puncture the lies and tell the truth. The truth is that Hamas still has thousands of armed terrorists in Gaza. It vows to repeat the savagery of the October 7th massacre and to do so again and again and again. It openly professes its goal to destroy the state of Israel. It subjugates Gazans, it steals their foods, it shoots them when they try to move to safe zones. And I think it's instructive that now many Gazans are fighting back. They're begging us, they're begging the world, free us, and free Gaza from Hamas. No nation can accept a genocidal terrorist organization, an organization committed to its annihilation, a stone's throw from its citizens. Our goal is not to occupy Gaza. Our goal is to free Gaza, free it from Hamas terrorists. The war can end tomorrow if Gaza, or rather if Hamas lays down its arms and releases all the remaining hostages. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will have overriding security responsibility. A security zone will be established on Gaza's border with Israel to prevent future terrorist incursions. A civilian administration will be established in Gaza that will seek to live in peace with Israel. That's our plan for the day after Hamas, and let me summarize it. 5 principles for concluding the war. 1, Hamas disarmed. 2nd, all hostages freed. 3rd, Gaza demilitarized. 4th, Israel has overriding security control. And 5, non-Israeli, peaceful civilian administration. By that I mean a civilian administration that doesn't educate its children for terror, doesn't pay terrorists, and doesn't launch terrorist attacks against Israel. That's what we want to see in Gaza. So it's neither Hamas nor the PA. That's our plan. Given Hamas's refusal to lay down its arms, Israel has no choice but to finish the job and complete the defeat of Hamas.
Speaking after a security cabinet recently approved a much criticized plan to take control of Gaza City, Netanyahu says that he has no choice but to complete the job and defeat Hamas to free hostages seized by the terrorist group. Israel's military has targeted an Al Jazeera correspondent with an airstrike, killing him, another one of its journalists, along with 6 other people sheltering outside of a Gaza City hospital. Officials at Shifa Hospital confirmed the deaths of correspondents Anas al-Sharif and Mohammed Kiraika, along with 4 other journalists and 2 other people.
We condemn utterly the killing of 5 Al Jazeera journalists in a targeted attack by the Israeli forces. CPJ warned several weeks ago that it was concerned about the safety of Anas al-Sharif after an Israeli military spokesperson alleged, without providing any evidence, that Anas was a terrorist. It wasn't just Anas al-Sharif that was killed. It was an entire news crew. It was the entire Al Jazeera Gaza City news crew killed in that attack. The smearing of journalists as terrorists without providing evidence is systematic. It has a clear aim, which is to discredit those journalists.
Israel's military described al-Sharif as a Hamas leader, an allegation dismissed by Al Jazeera. The network called the strike a targeted assassination. This incident marks the first time during the conflict that Israel has swiftly claimed responsibility following a journalist's death. And with the death of the Al Jazeera journalist raising tensions, there appears to be a growing gap between the Israeli government and the global media. Our contributor David Clement has more.
The war between Israel and Hamas continues on, but another battle is emerging: the state of Israel versus the international press. Over the past few months, and even just the last few weeks, there have been several high-profile mistakes made by major international media outlets. Let's start with the New York Times. Late last month, the New York Times ran a front-page feature headlined, "Young, Old, and Sick Starve to Death in Gaza. There is Nothing." It was accompanied by a heart-wrenching photo of 18-month-old Mohammed Zakaria al-Mutawak appearing severely malnourished. The caption described him as born healthy, and the article tied his condition to the broader famine in Gaza, noting that his father was killed while foraging for food. His mother was quoted in the piece saying, quote, "I look at him and I can't help but cry," amplifying the emotional impact. But social media sleuths quickly flagged inconsistencies. Mohammed had a significant pre-existing health disorder unrelated to the war or food shortages, a detail previously covered by other outlets. Critics accused the Times of cherry-picking facts to fit a narrative blaming Israel. In fact, former Times opinion editor Adam Rubinstein blasted it on X as, quote, "a remarkable deception, arguing that the paper buried the actual story of the child's malnutrition to tell a different story. He questioned their motive and implied bias. After days of silence on inquiries, the Times issued an editor's note updating the article to include information from Mohammed's doctor and medical records about his pre-existing issues. But spokesperson Nicole Taylor defended the reporting, stating, quote, "Children in Gaza are malnourished and starving, as New York Times reporters and others have documented," and she emphasized added context for greater understanding and praised the team's brave work in Gaza while providing a free access link to the revised piece. And this New York Times example is just one of what is now becoming a growing and uncomfortable trend. Revelations from a German investigation have led top agencies to cut ties with a Gaza-based photographer accused of staging dramatic hunger scenes. The controversy centers around Anas Sayed Vatia, a photographer for Turkey's state-owned Anadolu agency, whose images of children clutching empty bowls and crowds scrambling for food have appeared in outlets like CNN, BBC, and New York Magazine. A German documentary by Germany's Süddeutsche Zeitung exposed these photos as staged, not captured at actual aid distribution centers, but in contrived settings that wide-angle shots revealed were inconsistent with real humanitarian crises. This has sparked accusations of misleading the public about Gaza's dire situation. Now, in response, major European photo agencies have acted swiftly. The German press agency and AFP in France announced that they're dropping the photographer entirely over ethical breaches. But Reuters, however, stood by the images, insisting that they adhere to standards of accuracy, independence, and impartiality. These scandals highlight broader challenges in covering Gaza, where limited access for international reporters means reliance on local sources, potentially under tight control in Hamas-governed areas. Critics argue that staging erodes trust, selectively framing narratives that influence global opinion. As media ethics come under scrutiny, it underscores the need for rigorous verification and context in war reporting to ensure authenticity amid evolving public debates. In a time when images shape perceptions of conflict, this case serves as a stark reminder. Question what you see. Back to you.
Coming up, we'll have more news after the break. Australia's Prime Minister has announced that Australia will recognize a Palestinian state. Anthony Albanese's decision follows internal pressure and criticism over the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which he described as a catastrophe.
The international community is moving to establish a Palestinian state, and it is opposing actions which undermine the two-state solution. The Netanyahu government is rapidly expanding illegal settlements. Settler violence in the West Bank has increased. There have been threats to annex the occupied Palestinian territories and proposing the permanent forced displacement of the Palestinian people. These actions, together with the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, risk putting a two-state solution out of reach for a generation. I've said it publicly and I said it directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The situation in Gaza has gone beyond the world's worst fears. Far too many innocent lives have been lost. The Israeli government continues to defy international law and deny sufficient aid, food and water to desperate people, including children. This vital aid must be allowed to get to the people who need it most. This is about much more than drawing a line on a map. This is about delivering a lifeline to the people of Gaza.
Now, the move aligns with recent signals from leaders in Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. The recognition will be formalized at the United Nations General Assembly in September. Conditions include no role for Hamas in a Palestinian government. Firefighters from Moncton, Dieppe, and Riverview are battling a wildfire north of the Irishtown Nature Park near Moncton. The rural New Brunswick community of Maple Hills, which includes Irishtown, has posted on its Facebook page that it is asking some residents to, quote, take immediate steps to prepare for a possible evacuation. As of 8 p.m. local time on Sunday, no evacuation order had been given, but the community was urging people to have personal belongings and pets ready to go. One of Newfoundland's active wildfires gained more ground over the weekend, threatening various structures. Newfoundland and Labrador Premier John Hogan says that it's too early to know how many structures have been lost in the Adams Cove, Kingston, and Western Bay areas due to high smoke and fire suppression efforts blocking visibility. Late Friday, that wildfire was reported to have destroyed 9 homes in the small town of Small Point, Adams Cove, Blackhead, Broad Cove.
Unfortunately, we can't, based on the suppression efforts and the smoke, evaluate exactly what structures are lost at this time, but we will continue to evaluate and provide that detailed information to the individuals as soon as we can. The action on the Kingston fire right now, there's 4 air tankers actively working to contain the fire spread on the north end of this fire. That is all the water bombers in Newfoundland and Labrador's fleet. There's 1 bird dog, 5 helicopters, 2 from the Coast Guard in supporting roles, and 50 ground crew working on the fire. Of course, the safety of our brave frontline heroes is a priority. Local fire departments have been advised of risks associated with the fire while attempting to provide structure protection, and a plan is always in place to increase coordination and increase situational awareness by all to make sure that those on the ground are always safe.
Well, it appears as though the heat wave is not over yet for Toronto and its surrounding areas. Daytime temperatures hit 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, but with the humidity, it felt more like 37 to 40. Environment Canada has a heat warning in effect for a large stretch of Ontario, including Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, and the Niagara regions. This hot spell is expected to last through Tuesday and possibly into Wednesday for some areas, especially in eastern Ontario and parts of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton regions. A 6.1 magnitude earthquake has struck Turkey's northwestern province of Balıkesir, killing at least 1 person and causing about a dozen buildings to collapse. The quake hit Sunday with the epicenter in the town of Sindirci. Shocks were felt as far away as Istanbul and other nearby provinces. Rescue teams recovered the body of 1 person trapped in the debris. 4 others were rescued. A total of 16 buildings and 2 mosque minarets collapsed in the region. Coca-Cola has said that it will add a cane sugar version of its trademark cola to its U.S. lineup later this fall. That confirms a recent announcement by Donald Trump, who said in a social media post last week that Coca-Cola had agreed to use real cane sugar in its flagship product in the U.S. Coke confirmed the new product when it announced its second quarter financial results. Coca-Cola reported better than expected earnings as higher prices overcame weaker sales volumes. Case volumes fell 1% globally and 1% in North America. Coke, however, said the pricing was up 6% for the April to June period. Our contributor David Clement has more on what's next for the iconic brand.
In a move that's sparking both excitement among Coke enthusiasts and concerns among economists, Coca-Cola has announced plans to introduce a new cane-sweetened version of its iconic drink this fall. However, this seemingly sweet innovation risks upending the U.S. sugar market, potentially driving up imports and costs amid lingering trade tensions. Let's break it down. Coca-Cola revealed that American consumers could soon sip on a Coke made with pure U.S. cane sugar, ditching the high fructose corn syrup that's been the standard sweetener in most U.S. sodas for decades. Now, this isn't a full overhaul of their lineup. It's just a new variant aimed at tapping into the growing demand for what some perceive as more natural ingredients. The announcement comes hot off the heels of a suggestion from President Donald Trump, where he floated the idea that Coca-Cola might switch entirely to cane sugar. However, the company's current rollout is more targeted, focusing on limited edition products to test the waters. Now, why the potential upheaval? Well, the U.S. sugar industry relies heavily on domestic production, but cane sugar specifically is in shorter supply in the U.S. compared to beet sugar or corn-based alternatives. U.S. farmers simply can't ramp up cane production fast enough to meet a surge in demand if this new Coke takes off. That means that we'd likely see a spike in imports, primarily from major producers like Mexico and Brazil. And here's where it gets sticky. Those imports could face higher costs due to tariffs imposed during the first Trump administration, which aimed to protect domestic agriculture, but have complicated global trade flows ever since. Experts are warning that success for cane-sweetened Coke could create ripple effects across the market. Imagine higher prices for sweeteners trickling down to everything from baked goods to other beverages. There's also the possibility that competitors might jump on the bandwagon. Think Pepsi or smaller craft soda makers, further straining supplies and forcing even more reliance on foreign sources. In a nation already grappling with inflation and supply chain vulnerabilities, this could add another layer of complexity to food and beverage costs for everyday Americans. Of course, Coca-Cola isn't new to experimenting with sweeteners. They've offered cane sugar versions in other countries and even limited runs in the U.S. before. But scaling it up in the U.S. market, especially under the current political and economic climate, marks a bold bet. Will consumers embrace the change enough to justify the risks? Only time and sales figures will tell. Back to you.
A tribute to former Liverpool forward Diogo Jota and his brother Andrea Silva was disrupted on Sunday when some fans at the Community Shield match failed to observe a moment of silence. Before the game between Liverpool and Crystal Palace at Wembley, both teams and their staff stood silently to commemorate the brothers who died in a car accident in Spain back in July. But loud voices could be heard in the crowd, which prompted some people to boo.
And memory of Diogo Jota and his brother Andre Silva. The silence will start and end on the referee's whistle.
Jen Powell, a 48-year-old former art teacher, made U.S. sports history over the weekend when she became the first female umpire of a Major League Baseball game during the regular season. Powell, whose debut came on Saturday in a game between the Marlins and Braves, was given a standing ovation as she arrived on the field. Supporters held up signs reading, "Powell making herstory instead of history," and, quote, "The time has come for one and all to play ball," a nostalgic reference to a league of their own. That was the classic sports film about women's baseball league during the Second World War.
I'd say, well, when we walked the field, when we got out, when we walked the field early as a crew, and then Gooch and I were looking at each other, and I said, "This is it. Like, this is what we worked for." Mm-hmm. So I think it hit me then, and then we had a really special moment at the end where, right when they were doing the final pitcher check for top of the ninth, we kind of hugged and stuff, and like really hit me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, just incredible. Like dream came true. Like the dream actually came true today, and I'm still living in it, and I'm just so grateful to my family, to Major League Baseball for just creating such an amazing work environment, to all the umpires that I work with, who we have just amazing camaraderie, and we're having fun out there. We're working hard, but we're having fun, and I'm just so thankful.
Congratulations, Jen. Well, that's a wrap of national and international news for today. I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks so much for watching.